It's August 2nd, 2026, and in the space of about 15 minutes, 3 of Iran's biggest wartime claims got taken apart in a single social media post. Not by Israel, not by some outside analyst, by USAMA Central Command itself, point by point, in plain English, with the receipts to back it up. If you've been following this war since Operation Epic Fury kicked off back in February, you already know Iran has a pattern of announcing massive victories that quietly disappear a few hours later. But this one is different, because for the first time in a while, CENTCOM didn't just deny one claim, it lined up 3 of them back to back, and dismantled the entire narrative in one breath. So let's break down exactly what Iran said, what actually happened, why the technical claim never had a chance of holding up, and why this keeps happening over and over again with this regime. Here's the timeline, because the timeline tells you almost everything you need to know before you even get to the technical details. On Thursday, Iranian state media, citing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, put out a statement claiming their aerospace forces had struck the deployment ramp and maintenance hangar at Al-Azraq Air Base in Jordan, sometimes referred to as Prince Hassan Air Base, using a barrage of ballistic missiles. According to the IRGC, 3 F-35 fighter jets were completely destroyed, and 3 more sustained heavy damage. They framed the strike as retaliation for an earlier U.S. attack on residential structures on Iran's Qeshm Island. That's a massive claim. 3 F-35s destroyed on the ground would be an unprecedented loss for the United States Air Force, the kind of headline that would dominate global coverage for a week straight. Except it didn't happen. Hours later, CENTCOM responded on social media with a post that read almost like a scoreboard, knocking down claim after claim in real time without a single hedge word in it. The first claim CENTCOM addressed wasn't even about the aircraft. It was about the Strait of Hormuz itself. The IRGC has repeatedly stated that free and open shipping routes through the strait are dangerous for commercial vessels, trying to paint the picture that international shipping is under threat because of American operations in the region. CENTCOM's response was blunt. The actual danger to commercial vessels and their civilian crews comes from the IRGC's own verbal threats and attempted attacks, not from anything the United States is doing out there. Sit with that framing for a second. Iran is trying to convince the world that the water itself has become dangerous because of the blockade, when in reality, the blockade exists precisely because Iran has spent months threatening, harassing, and in some cases actually attacking commercial shipping through that same waterway. It's like an arsonist warning the fire department that their trucks are the ones causing all the smoke in the neighborhood. Then came the second claim, the big one, the headline grabber. 3 F-35 stealth fighters and 3 other aircraft, supposedly destroyed during an Iranian attack on an American airbase. CENTCOM's fact check on this one was a single sentence, and it didn't leave much room for interpretation. No U.S. aircraft were destroyed or damaged in recent attempted Iranian attacks. All missiles and drones were either intercepted or failed to reach their targeted areas. That's the entire statement. No hedging, no assessment ongoing, no, we're still gathering information. A flat, direct denial from the command that actually operates the aircraft in question and would know within hours if something that catastrophic had actually occurred. And this wasn't even an isolated incident at that specific base. Al-Azraq had already been targeted once before, back on July 9th, when the IRGC fired somewhere between 10 and 12 ballistic missiles at the facility. Jordan's air defenses intercepted 8 of them, and at the time, Jordanian authorities reported no confirmed casualties and no significant damage. So this was now the second time in roughly 3 weeks that Iran had gone after the same base, claimed a devastating result, and been contradicted almost immediately by the people who would actually know what happened on the ground. The third claim involved a tanker called the MT Nora. Iranian state media reported that this commercial oil tanker had successfully broken through the American naval blockade, which would have been a genuine embarrassment for the U.S. Military, since the entire point of that blockade is to squeeze Iran's illicit oil exports and cut off the cash flow that keeps the IRGC funded and operational. CENTCOM shut that one down too, and shut it down hard. The commercial vessel did not break through what CENTCOM has taken to calling the steel wall blockade. According to their own published numbers, more than 20 U.S. warships, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of service members remain actively enforcing that blockade around the clock every single day. As of that same week, CENTCOM had already redirected 24 commercial vessels attempting to move through the area, and had boarded at least one to verify blockade compliance directly. So not only did the tanker not break through, the overall enforcement numbers actually point toward the blockade tightening over time, not loosening. Now here's why this matters beyond just one news cycle. This is not a one-off mistake by Iranian state media having a bad information day. This is a pattern, and it's a pattern that stretches back well over a year at this point. Go back to the 12-day war in the summer of 2025, before any of this current phase even started. Iranian outlets with close ties to the government, specifically Tasnim News, which has direct links to the Revolutionary Guards, claimed that Iran had shot down 4 Israeli F-35 fighter jets during that conflict. At the time, military analysts were already skeptical, because no F-35 has ever been confirmed shot down in combat by anyone, anywhere, in the entire operational history of the aircraft. Israel's military spokesperson at the time called the reports complete fake news on the record, by name. And eventually, months later, Iran's own state broadcaster admitted the claim was false. The head of that broadcasting organization came out publicly and said they had relied on a military source that turned out to be unreliable, and that the whole incident had damaged the organization's credibility going forward. Read that again. That's Iran's own state media admitting they fabricated a story about shooting down a stealth fighter that, as far as the entire public record shows, has never actually been shot down by anyone in combat ever. Fast forward to March of 2026. The IRGC claimed it had struck and seriously damaged a U.S. F-35 over central Iran, saying the fate of the aircraft was unknown and that there was a high possibility it had crashed somewhere in Iranian territory. CENTCOM's response at the time was almost word for word what we just saw happen again in July. More than 8,000 combat flights had been flown during Operation Epic Fury up to that point, and no U.S. fighter aircraft had been shot down by Iran in any of them. A few weeks later, in May, Iran claimed it had shot down a second F-35 and an Israeli F-16 on the very same day. And around that same period, a video started circulating online supposedly showing the actual wreckage of a downed American F-35 sitting in the open. Researchers who dug into that footage found it was AI-generated, produced using consumer image generation tools, not real combat footage of anything. So, in the span of roughly a year, you've got Iran's own state broadcaster admitting to a fabricated F-35 claim, multiple separate F-35 shoot-down claims formally rejected by CENTCOM, and at least one viral video confirmed to be a complete AI fabrication designed to look like wreckage. That's the track record we're working with here. This isn't Iran having one bad day with the fog of war clouding their judgment. This is a deliberate information strategy that keeps getting deployed on a loop, and it keeps collapsing under basic scrutiny every single time it's tested. So why do they keep doing it if it never actually holds up under any real examination? That's the more interesting question, honestly, and it's worth sitting with for a minute instead of just laughing it off as regime incompetence. There are a few layers here, and they're worth pulling apart one at a time. The most obvious one is domestic. Iran's economy right now is in genuinely rough shape, and it's not a minor rough patch either. The rial has been in free fall for months, trading at some of its worst levels ever recorded against the dollar, with reports putting it around 1.75 million rials to a single US dollar. Inflation has been running well above 50% by multiple independent estimates, with the IMF putting consumer price growth at over 42% for 2025 alone with no improvement expected. Iran's own deputy labor minister has confirmed at least 1 million direct job losses tied to the war. Independent economists have put the total number of jobs at risk, once you factor in the ripple effects across the economy, somewhere between 10 and 12 million, which is close to half the entire national workforce. On top of all that, Iran went through a nationwide internet blackout that stretched past 50 consecutive days at one point, becoming one of the longest sustained nationwide internet shutdowns ever recorded anywhere in the world. And it hit home-based workers especially hard, with women accounting for roughly a third of all unemployment claims filed in the 2 months after the shutdown began. Add nationwide protests over shuttered shops and economic collapse, a couple of major private banks failing and getting absorbed into state institutions, and a supreme leader publicly ordering citizens to cut back on food, water, and fuel consumption because the state can no longer guarantee steady supply, and you start to understand why this regime desperately needs a win to hand its own population. Any win, even a fabricated one. If your currency is collapsing, your job market is bleeding out, and your own citizens are protesting in the streets, announcing that you just destroyed 3 American stealth fighters is a remarkably effective way to change the conversation for 24 hours, even if none of it is actually true. The second layer is information warfare aimed outward rather than inward. There's a real sizable segment of the global audience that will believe Iranian state claims over American ones almost regardless of the evidence in front of them, purely out of ideological alignment or a general baseline distrust of US government messaging built up over decades. Iran knows this audience exists, and they're not trying to convince CENTCOM or the Pentagon Press Corps of anything. They're trying to seed a narrative into the broader information ecosystem that spreads faster than any correction ever could catch up to it. That's a tactic as old as propaganda itself, but it's been supercharged by modern social media, where a dramatic false claim about a downed stealth fighter can rack up millions of views and shares before a boring, accurate correction. From a government press office ever reaches the same audience. By the time CENTCOM's fact-check post goes out with its plain, factual language, the original dramatic claim has already done its job in a huge share of the timelines that actually matter to Tehran's messaging strategy. Now, let's actually get into why the technical claim falls apart so quickly once you look closely at it. Because this is where it gets genuinely interesting from a pure military standpoint, and it's worth understanding in some depth. Destroying an F-35 on the ground with a ballistic missile barrage is an extraordinarily difficult thing to actually pull off, and it's even harder to convincingly prove happened afterward if it somehow did. Al-Azraq sits out in Jordan's eastern desert, hosting F-35 aircraft as part of joint U.S. and Jordanian operations. It functions specifically as a hub for that kind of coordinated mission work. When Iran fired that first wave back on July 9th, Jordanian air defenses intercepted the clear majority of the incoming missiles, 8 out of a claimed 10 to 12. That's already a strong interception rate against ballistic threats, which are genuinely difficult targets to hit reliably given their speed and trajectory. Now layer American systems on top of Jordanian ones, systems like Patriot batteries and other integrated air defense assets that have been surging into the region throughout this entire operation, and you're looking at multiple independent defensive shields stacked over the same piece of real estate. For 3 F-35s to actually be destroyed on the ground, you'd need missiles to not only get past that layered redundant defense, but to specifically land with enough precision and explosive yield to total hardened aircraft sitting inside shelters or hangars that are typically built to survive exactly this kind of attack scenario. And if that had genuinely happened, there would be essentially zero ambiguity about it afterward. Satellite imagery moves fast in a conflict this closely monitored. Open source analysts routinely pull commercial satellite passes within hours of any significant strike in an active zone like this one, and the wreckage of a destroyed 5th generation stealth fighter would be completely unmistakable from orbit, no matter how you tried to frame it. Nobody has produced that imagery. No serial numbers, no geolocated photographs, no wreckage independently confirmed by any neutral third party outside Iran's own state media apparatus. Just a statement from a broadcaster with a well-documented track record of retracted claims stretching back over a year. Compare that to how the United States handles its own bad days in this same conflict, because that contrast is actually what gives CENTCOM's denials so much credibility when you line them up side by side. Back on March 1st of this year, 3 American F-15E Strike Eagles were lost in a friendly fire incident involving a Kuwaiti F-A-18. That's a real, fully documented, genuinely embarrassing incident for the coalition. All 6 crew members ejected safely and were recovered, and the incident was reported and formally acknowledged through official channels rather than buried. That's how a real operational loss gets communicated, with specifics attached, with an incident timeline, with a recovery outcome documented start to finish. When Iran later claimed to have separately shot down an F-15 that was allegedly violating its airspace near Hormuz Island, CENTCOM shut that down within the same news cycle, pointing directly at the fact that U.S. forces had flown more than 8,000 combat sorties during the operation up to that point without losing a single fighter to actual enemy fire. The contrast really does matter here. When the U.S. loses something, even to its own forces by accident in the chaos of combat, it says so, with names, with numbers, with outcomes attached. When Iran claims a loss specifically inflicted by their own forces, it evaporates under the very first round of basic questions almost every single time it's been tested. Let's also talk about the blockade piece in more depth, because that third claim about the tanker Nora is arguably the most strategically revealing of the 3, even though it got the least attention in the initial coverage. Iran's economy is being strangled specifically through its illicit oil exports, and that naval blockade is the primary mechanism doing the strangling. Every barrel that doesn't get sold on the black market is money the IRGC doesn't get to funnel toward its proxy network, its missile production, and its own basic survival as an institution. So a story claiming a tanker broke through isn't just a random propaganda beat picked out of thin air. It's targeted directly at the one pressure point that actually threatens the regime's ability to fund itself going forward. If Iranian media can convince domestic and international audiences that the blockade has real holes in it, that undermines the entire strategic premise behind months of sustained pressure. CENTCOM's response laid out the actual scale of the enforcement operation in specific terms. More than 20 warships, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of personnel, 24 vessels already redirected in that stretch alone. Multiple boardings conducted to verify compliance directly. That's not a symbolic blockade with convenient gaps quietly left in it for show. That's a sustained, heavily resourced, multi-domain operation, and the actual numbers back up the claim that it's holding firm rather than leaking. Now let's zoom out to the broader shape of this entire war, because the F-35 claim didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a much bigger campaign that's worth understanding properly. This whole current cycle kicked off again after a ceasefire collapsed earlier in July. following the original operation that began this entire chapter back on February 28, 2026, when U.S. and Israeli forces launched a massive coordinated strike campaign against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, missile production sites, and senior military leadership simultaneously. That original operation, codenamed Epic Fury by the American side and Roaring Lion by the Israeli side, was enormous in scale from the very first hour. Roughly 200 aircraft dropped more than 550 munitions on over 500 targets inside Iran within that opening day alone, and the strikes expanded to well over 1,700 targets struck within the first 72 hours, and past 5,000 targets within the first 10 days of sustained operations. The stated objectives, laid out directly by the administration, were to prevent Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon, destroy its ballistic missile arsenal and production infrastructure, degrade its regional proxy networks, and effectively annihilate its navy, with regime change from within understood as the broader political goal sitting underneath all four military objectives. The opening wave also included the assassination of then Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with several senior IRGC commanders and defense officials, fundamentally reshaping the leadership structure of the regime overnight. In just the first 24 hours, the United Arab Emirates alone reported intercepting 137 missiles and 209 drones fired in the general chaos of Iranian retaliation across the region. That original operation fundamentally reset the balance of power by dismantling a huge portion of Iran's integrated air defense architecture right out of the gate, which is exactly why everything Iran has attempted since then, including this latest Al-Azraq claim, has had to lean so heavily on dispersed, harder-to-detect tactics rather than large, coordinated conventional strikes, because the conventional option was mostly taken off the table in that opening campaign. Since Epic Fury, we've watched this pattern repeat itself in cycles roughly every few weeks. The U.S. strikes something significant inside Iran. Iran responds with a barrage aimed at American, Israeli, or partner nation targets across the region. Most of that barrage gets intercepted by layered air defenses. And then Iranian state media puts out claims of major American losses that consistently fail to hold up under any scrutiny. Jordan alone has now intercepted incoming missiles on multiple consecutive days during this latest cycle, which tells you Iran is still attempting these attacks on a regular, almost routine basis. They're simply not succeeding at anywhere near the rate their own state propaganda keeps claiming. There's also a regional diplomatic angle here worth understanding because it shows just how seriously America's regional partners are taking the risk of this conflict widening any further. Saudi Arabia's defense minister traveled to Washington and met directly with the vice president, specifically to urge the administration not to expand this conflict further by opening new fronts against the Houthis in Yemen or against Iran-aligned militias operating inside Iraq. One source close to those discussions described further escalation as opening the door to major unknown risks for the entire region. That's a genuinely significant signal worth paying attention to. Saudi Arabia isn't exactly sympathetic to Tehran, given the decades of regional rivalry between them, but even they are visibly cautious about how far this expands, because a wider war creates instability that nobody in the region actually benefits from, regardless of which side of this conflict they're formally aligned with. U.S. officials have also privately acknowledged concerns about munitions, stockpiles, if this campaign keeps expanding in scope and duration, which is a completely legitimate strategic and logistical consideration, entirely separate from anything Iran happens to be claiming in its press releases on any given day. Let's cover a few other developments unfolding around this same window too, because the picture doesn't end with just the F-35 claim itself. Jordan's own air defense network has now intercepted incoming Iranian missiles for 4 consecutive days as of this latest cycle, which underscores just how frequently these attacks are actually being attempted, even when the overwhelming majority of them get swatted down before they can do any real damage on the ground. Iranian state television also reported that several of its own Revolutionary Guard personnel were killed in a U.S. missile strike in Zanjan province during this same stretch, a reminder that this conflict is inflicting real documented losses on the Iranian side, even as their propaganda apparatus stays almost entirely focused on manufacturing American losses that simply don't exist in reality. President Trump, following the latest round of Iranian strikes on American assets in the region, stated publicly at a White House press conference that the United States would respond very hard, framing it plainly as Washington's turn to strike after absorbing the most recent Iranian barrage aimed at U.S. positions. That's essentially the rhythm this entire conflict has settled into over the past several months. Strike, intercept, propaganda claim, denial, and then the next round begins on roughly the same schedule. If you want the honest, unemotional read on why this pattern keeps repeating itself, it really comes down to incentive structures on both sides of this information war. For the United States, and CENTCOM specifically, the incentive is long-term credibility. Every time they issue a fact check that turns out to be accurate under later scrutiny, And so far, the pattern shows they've been consistently accurate across every single one of these disputed claims. They build a track record that makes their statements more trusted the next time something actually does go seriously wrong, and something eventually will, because that's simply the nature of sustained combat operations stretched out over months. For Iran, the incentive runs in almost the opposite direction entirely. Their real target audience isn't the international press corps carefully parsing satellite imagery for confirmation. It's a domestic population that's exhausted, financially broke, and increasingly skeptical of the regime after years of documented economic mismanagement, plus segments of the international audience already predisposed to distrust American government messaging on principle regardless of the topic. A claim doesn't need to survive any real scrutiny to do its job for that specific audience. It just needs to exist long enough to generate a headline, a viral clip, and a temporary morale boost before the correction ever manages to catch up to it in the same feeds. Here's the part that I think genuinely gets lost in a lot of the day-to-day coverage of moments like this one. People tend to treat these dueling claims as just background noise. Another day of he said, she said chaos in a messy war zone, and scroll straight past it without a second thought. But if you actually track the pattern carefully over time, the way we just did together, going all the way back to the 12-day war and the 4 F-35 claims from summer 2025 through the March 2026 F-35 claim, the May double claim involving both an F-35 and an F-16, the AI-generated wreckage video, and now this July 15-minute collapse of 3 separate claims dismantled in a single social media post, you start to see something that looks a lot more like a repeatable strategy than a series of unrelated coincidences. Every single one of these claims follows almost the exact same structural playbook. Announce something dramatic and conveniently unverifiable in the immediate aftermath of a strike. Let it spread through sympathetic and neutral channels alike before anyone has time to properly check it. And then either quietly let it fade from the news cycle or, in rare cases, formally walk it back the way Iran's own state broadcaster did after those F-35 claims from the summer of 2025. That's not disorganized chaos. That's a repeatable, almost mechanical process. And understanding it as a process rather than a series of one-off events is really what helps you evaluate the next claim that comes out of Tehran whenever it happens next. And based on this entire track record, it almost certainly will happen again soon. So where does this actually leave things as we head into the next phase of this conflict? The blockade appears to be holding based on the specific numbers CENTCOM has published, with vessel redirections and boardings happening on a rolling, continuous basis rather than as isolated incidents. Jordan's air defenses, combined with American systems layered on top, continue intercepting the clear majority of what Iran throws at regional bases. And there's still no verified evidence whatsoever, not one confirmed piece, of a U. F-35 or any other American fighter jet being destroyed by Iranian action throughout this entire campaign, despite at least 4 or 5 separate claims to that exact effect stretching back well over a year now. Meanwhile, the economic pressure inside Iran keeps compounding month over month, which might honestly be the more important story quietly running underneath all of this military back and forth we've been discussing. A regime that's burning through currency reserves, watching its own workforce hemorrhage, jobs by the millions, and struggling to keep basic services running during a brutal summer heat wave, is a regime that needs propaganda wins more than it needs actual battlefield ones. Because right now, the battlefield keeps handing them documented losses, while the information space remains the only place they can still manufacture something that looks like a victory, even if that manufactured victory only lasts for the 15 minutes it takes CENTCOM to log on and post the plain, unglamorous truth. What do you think is actually driving this pattern at its core? Is it purely about shoring up domestic morale during an economic collapse? Or is there a bigger information war angle here aimed at shaping global public opinion before any correction ever has a chance to land properly? Drop your honest takedown in the comments, because there's always a genuinely solid discussion happening underneath these breakdowns once people start comparing notes. If this kind of deep dive into what's actually happening versus what's merely being claimed is useful to you, go ahead and hit like on your way out. It genuinely helps get this kind of grounded analysis in front of more people who are trying to cut through the noise on this conflict every single day. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. Because with how fast this entire situation keeps shifting week to week, there's going to be a lot more of these claims to break down properly in the days and weeks ahead, and it's worth hearing the accurate version first instead of whatever dramatic version happens to go viral before anybody bothers to fact check it. Share this with anyone you know who's been following the war and getting genuinely confused by all the conflicting headlines, because a huge chunk of that confusion out there right now really is just people not realizing how consistent this specific pattern actually is once you lay all of it out side by side the way we just did. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.